Greetings, everyone. Pete Pardo here from Sea of Tranquility. Welcome to another episode of Friday Morning at the Funhouse alongside Mr. Martin Popoff. What's going on, Martin?
Yes. Morning, sir. Morning, sir. No, I'm just looking forward to doing this on a sweltering hot Toronto day. It's supposed to be the last of the heat waves, so we'll see.
I think that's
Yeah.
here too in New York. I think we've had almost identical weather to you. It's been every day like upper 80s, low mid 90s, humid, sweltering, thunderstorms
Yeah.
here and there, pounding
Yeah.
rain. It's just been the weirdest summer ever. But I think,
Sure.
yeah, I looked at like for New York anyway, for the Hudson Valley, for like the rest of August doesn't look all that bad. It's like low mid 80s pretty much the rest of the way, and so which is okay. I'm fine with that. Yeah, this 90 plus thing and high humidity is like, ugh, no thanks,
Yeah.
not interested.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
anyway,
Vermont thought they were immune from all this, and then all of a sudden Montpelier's flooded, right? So
yeah,
yeah.
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 What are you gonna do, right? Rain, rain, rain,
Yeah.
heat,
Yeah.
heat, heat. It's all we hear about these days. So
Yeah.
anyway, we've got another fun show for you here today. We got good reactions last week from the what if scenarios, and those were, what if certain youngish rock stars didn't leave us so soon like they did, right? So today we're not going to talk about deaths. We're going to talk about kind of cool what if scenarios relating to bands and albums and producers and lineups and all that sort of thing. We're not going to give too much away before we dive in. We've each got 5 examples of some cool things that we each have thought about over the years. Well, what if didn't quite turn out that way? What if this guy didn't do this, and so on and so forth? So this will be kind of fun. So we're just going to kind of give these scenarios and kind of talk about what might have happened had things been a little bit different. I'll have Martin kick us off with his first selection.
Yeah, so I started picking these, and it's like, oh man, I can't think of anything good, right? And then all of a sudden, well, that's a good one, and it's okay, I
Once you
got one.
start, it's
Okay, yeah,
ridiculous,
yeah,
right? I did the
yeah.
same
Two,
thing. I was like,
two
I don't know
more.
if I'm gonna be
Oh,
able to
what
come
do
up with 5, and then I had
yeah, what
I
do I
did
do? And then, oh, that's another good one. So yeah, and then I realized like the best way to do this, because I've seen people do shows on these what if things, and sometimes it can get a little goofy, and you go, well, what's the point of that sort of thing, right? And then I noticed a trend going that okay, the smart ones are that they're the interesting ones are the ones where it's like plausible that the band hits a fork in the road and could do A or B sort of thing. Like it just kind of makes sense. It's not completely goofy, right? So my first one is when we did the ZZ Top movie, it was fascinating hearing about that break they took, right? So they basically after Tejas, they did that massive tour. They were all like absolutely burned out, and then they went on this really interesting break, right? Where Frank kind of he goes out and gets clean, and Billy kind of goes on this odyssey and does a lot of travel. They all do some travel, right? But Billy kind of like you hear him popping up in London and in Paris and getting into synthesizers and all this stuff. And then Dusty's the bizarre one. He goes to the airport and he works as like a baggage handler, right? It's the
Not the
coolest thing,
craziest
right?
thing.
Yeah. So what if ZZ Top didn't take that break? So basically, they take the break after this album. Love this album to death. It's not very heavy. It's kind of obscure, weirdly recorded. I just love it. It's almost, I'd say it's pretty much my favorite, right? Then they come back with this in 79 and a new record deal, right? People forget it came in this thing, which is kind of cool. It came in like a second little cover, right?
Oh, I've never seen
And
that. Wow, nice.
yeah, it actually the whole album cover slips right into this thing,
So like
and
so
it's
basically a slipcase before there were slipcases.
yeah, nothing on the back. And then even it has its own extra one, right? So it's kind of cool, and it's all sort of it's mine. Yeah, mine is a US one, and it's all kind of flimsy, almost feels like import cardboard. It's kind of weird. But so they go all the way to 70 from 76 to 79. And then of course they eventually come back with this after El Loco. So it's so this is one that actually I was gonna do what if ZZ Top came out with a double live album, right? And then I figured, well, this is kind of the way to talk about that, right? So there's a bunch of bands that fall into this sort of thing that we could have talked about. But so if ZZ Top doesn't go on this break, maybe they don't get a new record deal. Maybe Frank dies. Maybe we don't even get Frank, and then the band breaks up, or they get another drummer. And they do have this break with London. They're not happy about that greatest hits album that comes out, sort of thing. So I don't know, maybe they stay with London. London is just generally not considered a good record label, but maybe they do come out with, instead of taking the type of break that they did, maybe they do come out with a double live album. We get that great ZZ Top double live album, and maybe we're talking about that in the pantheon of these great double live albums from the double live album golden period, right? Comes out in 77 or 78. So yeah.
I mean, that is, yeah, if anything was going to come out of that time period. And again, is that on them or is that on the record label, right? Because why didn't the record label jump on that and say, hey, we've got Frampton Comes Alive and Budokan and the Thin Lizzy and all these other bands that are releasing these great live albums, and we don't have one from ZZ Top in that time period. Basically, whether they knew that they weren't going to get any recorded output from them for a couple of years or not, why not crank one out? And even at some point, they don't, maybe they could do a quick tour to cash in on some of that. So you got the double live album, a quick little tour celebrating the live album, and then you get back into the studio later in the decade, which they did anyway.
Yeah, and the interesting thing with this band is that you constantly have that debate. Well, they are a trio, so how good a live album can they make? And do you take that extra step and fake in an extra rhythm guitar track or not, right? And then what do people say about that? And because it's going to be pretty obvious they're faking something. But they've proven over the years, just they've dropped down at certain times. Sometimes they've been great live, sometimes they haven't been great live, right? But they've proven they had the live in Texas, and you notice they can make really cool versions of these songs as a power trio. And of course, you got the live side of Fandango as well, right? And the other point I just wanted to make is maybe if Billy doesn't go on his odyssey of learning about new music and new technologies, you don't get this, right? Maybe they don't modernize their sound. I don't think El Loco's particularly a modernizing of their sound, nor is DeGueo. So the funny thing is they essentially take this long break, but the first album they come back with kind of just feels not all that far removed from Tejas.
Right.
Really even though it's this big, long, going out and cleaning up and changing things and the whole bit, changing your mind around. But yeah, it's essentially like Tejas. And it takes all the way to Eliminator to see them really incorporate technology.
Yeah, you also have to wonder too if those couple of years away kind of stalled their momentum a little bit. Granted, they became the huge band anyway a few years later, but could they have gotten there a little bit sooner? Had they struck while the iron was hot after all those albums and tours?
Yeah,
the 70s. Yeah, but yeah, they're the one band that always seems to come up when you talk about those great bands of the 70s that don't have that definitive live album from that time period. They always come up. All right, cool. So my first what if today is what if Rainbow did reunite with the classic Rising lineup after Richie finally leaves Deep Purple for the final time after Battle Rages On. So, of course, as we know, after that splintered, Richie decides to put Rainbow back together. They released this in 95, Stranger in the Soul, which, was kind of met with a little, indifference. I think it's got a lineup of basically nobodies, and did a tour, did the album, and then he put Rainbow to bed once again and did Blackmore's Night and moved into other things, right? But there was lots of rumors at the time that this idea was floating around, and Ronnie was up for it, Cozy was up for it, I'm sure Jimmy and Tony were up for it, but how much of these conversations happen, nobody really knows. I think you had mentioned on a previous show that Ronnie had talked, I think Chris Allo also, Ronnie had talked about it in various interviews that it was pretty close to happening, but it never actually did. And looking at Ronnie's career as well, he obviously went back to Sabbath for Dehumanizer, but that only lasted for an album and a tour. And then between that and whatever, he put the Dio band back together again. So is like 94, 95, is that too late to see a reunion of this great lineup to maybe go out and play this whole album in its entirety and maybe you get a new album out of it? Would people have cared? I really think they would have, because I think there was still lots of interest from the fans, even in the 90s, the decade that's obviously not big on metal anyway. But I think that there was enough interest in this album and this band, and to see those guys do something one more time. It never happened. And again, how close we saw it, I don't know. But I think Whether if they did it, would it have lasted longer than a one-time only thing? Would it have been just kind of like the Sabbath thing where they get back together, do the album, do the tour, and it blows up again? I would argue that Richie's interest in heavy rock probably was waning anyway, that he was always going to go do the Blackmore's Night thing. But I think it would have been really cool to see happen one more time, to play some big festivals, to do an album or a live album, for people to get to see this, who maybe were too young to get to see this played live on stage for the very, very first time.
Yeah, and I think you also get it becomes sort of acceptable later on, partially because of these Swedish and German bands doing it, that you can be in multiple bands at once. And Ronnie proved it with Heaven and Hell and Dio, that he'd, oscillate back and forth. That's all fine, right? Black Sabbath, Dio, and Heaven and Hell. So it's like I could picture Ronnie just humming along, having this great career. It's like, oh, festival dates with Rainbow, festival dates with Heaven and Hell, festival dates with Dio. It's summer, let's do this. Oh, I'll back myself up on a tour or whatever, right? And him having the super high profile with Rainbow would have helped his super high profile, or raise his profile with Dio and with Heaven and Hell, right?
Yeah.
So he could have done all these things at the same time, right?
And I would think that would be okay for Blackmore to say, all right, we're not committed to doing this full time, but we can do it when we want to. And Cozy at the time was doing all of this, that, and the other thing too, right? I mean, he was playing with Yngwie and all sorts of other stuff. So I think that if it wasn't, because I always thought that Blackmore had like a commitment issue, right? So I think if you say we're going to do this when we want to, we'll do the first big tour, maybe we'll do an album, and then we'll see if it's something we want to revisit again in a couple of years. But it's not like we're going to go out and tour for a year and whatever. I think if it was something more casual that they would commit to doing when the time felt right, I think it would have been good for all the folks involved. But we'll never.
And Richie would have loved the adulation. He would have loved the money.
Yeah.
The huge crowds, all that stuff. It's like,
Yeah.
you just go out and do this sort of thing. Maybe Cozy would still be with us. Maybe he would have been too busy to be driving around too fast.
Maybe, yeah,
or whatever, right? I mean, there obviously there's all sorts of different projects and stuff he worked on. Anyways, he was a busy guy, but yeah, just and it's in his best environment. It would have been like the best band. He would have had extra things in his catalog that were at the top of his resume, right?
Yeah, and I think for his
Rainbow
resume,
wow.
I think for his resume, it would have looked better than what he did a few years ago, where he once again he put together like a quick little Rainbow lineup of people who were never in Rainbow before and did those bunch of shows and whatnot, which most people look back on and think, that really wasn't all that great. And I don't really think his heart was into it. I think it would have been better to go out in style with this band and maybe put it to rest at the right time after you've had a chance to bring the classic lineup together. And like I said, whether you do an album or not, that's another thing. But I think that would have looked better than what he actually did way after the fact, when it didn't really matter so much anymore, and most of the guys weren't around to do it. So
yeah, cool. All right. So my next one is what if David Lee Roth was fired back in 76 or 77, when they had that notion, the Ted Templeman, they had the notion putting together that first album that, boy, it's really hard getting an accurate vocal out of Dave. They did a lot of cool stuff. Ted was very smart about what they ended up doing. He just like knuckled down and worked with them and kept, how hard it was away from the other guys, and pasted together vocals and just worked them hard to make sure they got great vocals. And of course, we got an amazing vocal performance out of Dave on all those records. Nobody ever complains about what his vocals are like on there. All that complaining stuff came more or less later on, or if he was kind of loaded on stage or whatever, you think of the US Festival or whatever. But, I definitely remember, there was never any thoughts that, oh, this guy is not a great singer. I mean, I like his voice. I like his singing. I like his style. Everything about him is cool. But had Sammy Hagar been hired on at that juncture, this is kind of where he went instead. We've got the pretty decent Street Machine album. We've got the live album kind of in that time period. But maybe if Dave was gone, he would have gone on the warpath and put together an even better band and climbed that mountain and climbed to the top. been even better than this stuff sooner. Imagine if we would have got a really angry David Lee Roth, like an angry Dave Mustaine, who put together the "I'm going to show you guys" band, and came out with something. And imagine if we had a band with him putting out records in 78, 79, 80, now fully moved away from being that generalist guy and seeing how cool being in a hard rock band has been, because he's there for a few years or whatever. So yeah, maybe he would have come out and been a competing band, a little bit like Ozzy Osbourne and a Sabbath. Maybe the world would have found, he would have got good management and good production, and all of a sudden, like, he's an even bigger superstar than Eddie, because Eddie's working in a little more of an academic world, just being a guitarist, and Dave is more like, it's a person. He's singing, he's jumping around, he's writing lyrics, he's doing he's a front man. So it's possible Dave could have been an even bigger star, and then they could have been a bigger band than Van Halen even was.
So let's take that one step further. So, obviously we know we got the Eat 'Em and Smile and Skyscraper later on, right? Tremendous band. I mean, no one doubts that, right? But let's say your scenario does happen and he's out on his own at the beginning of the 80s, right? Vi and Sheehan and those guys are not really anybody at that time yet. Mm-hmm. You got some interesting free agents out there, Martin, right around that time as well. Like Mr. Michael Schenker, Gary Moore, right? Yeah. Does a David Lee Roth warrant grabbing one of those guys to start a new band right around the start of the 80s to compete with the Van Halen, when those guys really maybe struggling to get a solo career going, right? Leaving their high profile bands, UFO, Thin Lizzy and whatnot.
That's interesting. But more likely he gets George Lynch or Carlos Cavazo or Warren DeMartini in there, right? So that's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
And because at that point, those bands they're all in their infancy. And they're basically all at the same size as Van Halen is they're even smaller probably than, some are about the same. Quiet Ride's about the same size, right? So maybe Randy Rhoads ends up in with David Lee Roth right away, right? So he gets some local hot shot, and they go out and they conquer that mountain, right?
Yeah.
So yeah.
Who knows, right? What if, right? All right, my next one. So this one has always confounded me. This was one of the first things I thought about when we were going to do this episode. I never understood at all why Ted Nugent and Derek St. Holmes couldn't make it work long term, because I think that on all those early albums, man, that voice with that guitar was a match made in heaven. I mean, those early albums, that's what's so great about them. It's like you got the both of them firing on all cylinders. I mean, you listen to this album, so good. I think for me, I always thought Ted was better playing guitar and maybe singing a song or two per album and let Derek be the front man. Because I think that Ted was just such a powerful presence on stage. He never should have felt any conflict with having another guy sharing the spotlight. Again, we don't know what goes on behind the scenes, but it seems to me, and as good as like some of these albums are as well, I always thought that those two guys together with that voice, and Derek also a really good on stage, had the look. I think like albums like this and all the ones that came after it, just he would bring Derek back here and there, but these guys couldn't make it work full time. And you look at some, I always thought that St. Holmes and Nugent could have been like a Tyler and Perry going forward into the 80s, and really being I think that Nugent would have made a much bigger impact had they carried over the success and the style of all those early albums they worked on together, because there was always something missing on all the albums that came afterwards. And to me, that something was always Derek St. Holmes. And every time he would appear on an album or do a tour, the magic would be back, but it would never last. And it's like, I always listen to these Nugent albums, all the ones afterwards, and I always like lots of them and things about them, but I'm always kind of like, man, how would that sound if Derek St. Holmes was there singing that, right? And I think that we will never know how big this band could have gotten had they stayed together and kept that formula going. If Ted could have kept his ego in check and say, all right, I can share the stage and the writing with this guy, because obviously this is a winning formula. Let's make it work. Martin, I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, that's great. I don't have a lot to add to that except to underscore that point about bands have a lot more potential when you've got two superstars in the band. You mentioned Tyler Perry, but Stones and Guns N' Roses are the same sort of thing. A band is better off when you've got at least a couple of stars in the band, and more is probably better too. But I've even heard it talked about and debated that there is kind of an optimum number, that like 2 stars is pretty much perfect. It's not too confusing. It's not diluting the gene pool very much, but it's better than one sort of thing, right? And you also think if a bunch of management and a bunch of labels and a bunch of movers and shakers also agree with that idea, maybe Ted Nugent is treated better, and more thought and more effort and sweat is put into making him have a great career, and his label deals are better and his promotion is better and all that, because he does have Derek there, right? And I love that idea about, so we also know this, there's a lot of people who don't like Ted singing out there, right? I personally really like his singing, and I, in a more combative mood, I'm just perfectly fine to say I like his singing as much as Derek's, right? Because I just love his voice. I love what he does with it. There's a little bit of that Ace Frehley goofball in it too when he's singing, which is kind of cool. But putting that aside and saying, okay, it's not better, maybe it's worse. It's really cool that they've got two lead singers in the band and they can break it up like that. And you don't get to the Ted Nugent track and you're ticked off that he's singing on those old albums. It's fine, right? But yeah, later on, it's like I can't get my head around, like, a lot of people think it's terrible that Ted sings every song on some of those later albums, and I'm like, I love his singing on those albums, so I'm good with it. But yeah, having 2 stars in the band is great. And then also what you have also happening with Ted Nugent in the 80s is you get it just starts to become a habit. The lineup changes, like too many people, and they're just faceless people, and Ted doesn't give them any spotlight, really. He doesn't really talk about them, except when he's doing the big standard, like long honor roll of I've played with the greatest rhythm sections of all time, and he'll mention these names, and you'll go, I even forgot about that guy. But it's kind of cool Ted's mentioning his name, right? But I mean, generally speaking, that isn't part of his DNA to say these guys are super great.
Right.
Yeah. And Derek, his personality is such that, he is his own person. He is going to push back, right?
Yeah.
And he's a bit of a rock star. He's got a bit of his ego himself, and he's a little more dangerous than Ted, right? He's got a little bit of, if Ted's got a little Ace Frehley in his voice, Derek's got a little Ace Frehley in his personality, right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm with you. I mean, I think having the variety in their early albums, both of them singing, I think works. And for me, Tala agrees apparently. For me, I prefer Ted singing like 3 songs an album. I don't dislike his voice, but I like having I prefer Derek's voice, but I don't mind Ted for a couple songs. That's why some of the later albums when it's all him, I'm just kind of like, I get a little fatigued with his voice. I don't dislike it, but I miss that variety. I just think that formula really works, and they couldn't keep that going, unfortunately.
Yeah. Cool. All right, so got an interesting one here, a little academic. What if Ian Gillan didn't buy Delaney Studios and rechristen it Kingsway, i.e., he didn't have his own studio, right? Because the funny thing about Ian Gillan is he also at this time, like, he got into a few business ventures, right? And they all kind of fail, and he basically jokes about how he doesn't know what to do with money. He's not a good businessman, right? So obviously we get all these great albums from Gillan. We got that one, Future Shock. So this is the 1, 2, 3. This is the 4th already. Wow, 4th album already.
Yeah.
This is the first album, the what they call the Japanese albums, just called Gillan. You don't get the logo, right? Yeah, weird back cover shot. This is my actual Japanese copy with the big thick cardboard, right? You get all these cool pictures in here, but and there's your Glory Road, but they're all recorded at Kingsway, right? And they all have this sort of trashy sound that we all kind of like, but it's a little obscure. It's, they're the punk Deep Purple. It's noisy. The drums, that you're really hearing the hi-hat, and not a ton of bottom end on these things. Not a lot of high fidelity. The guitars are really distorted. So on the negative, you're getting with this Kingsway studio sound, you're getting, okay, well, I got to use my own studio every time, right? But you're also getting, like, you're not working with big name producers or anything.
Right.
So, no Martin Birch or anything like
That's what I was
that.
going to say. What do you do? What happens if Martin Birch does get involved and produces one of their albums?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And you're taken away from this place. And what happens with this band with all this cool firepower and neat songs and on participating in the new wave of British heavy metal, if the record sounded better, I mean, they're definitely gonna, I think, do better in the States, because people talk about it in America. You want things glossed up a little more,
Yeah.
because this is definitely a non-glossy band. And they all sound pretty much the same. They all have this weird, interesting ethic to them. On the negative, what you don't get is you don't get all these cool B-sides all the time. All these excellent tracks that show up on B-sides of the singles and the for Gillen fans only, additional, basically full album that came with Glory Road, I guess, and on and on. I have a weird copy of it. I don't know why I have this thing, but I have one that's it actually came out in Canada. It's not even an English thing, right? Or a British thing. It's, I don't know how it came. It might even be like a promo. I don't know. But anyways, you get all that. So that's kind of cool. But yeah, this band could have been bigger, maybe, if you take away. And the last thing I want to say is maybe the band doesn't go broke and there's stress all the time, and they fall apart, and he's forced to go into Deep Purple because he's basically, just burning money on all these ventures of his that are not turning out, and the band crashes in flames and acrimony. So I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. I sometimes wonder that if they had gone like to a different production house with a name producer, if this band would have gotten a little further. I don't know. Would their sound been ready made for American audiences a little bit more that way? I'd argue possibly, although quite frankly, I don't know if I would want to change those albums at all. I think they're perfect the way they are. But to get this band to where maybe they wanted to go or needed to go, maybe that would have been the case. So who knows?
Yeah. Yeah, you had Chris Tangerides out there. You could have worked with Mutt Lange or
a lot of guys,
Werman or something. Yeah, Jack Douglas. Yeah, anything could have happened where, just get him out of that mindset. It's like, okay, guys, are you really trying to make it here, sort of thing?
Yeah. You'll never know. You'll never know. All right, so my next pick is kind of an interesting one I've thought about many times. And if you remember, Martin, back when Fast Eddie Clarke left Motorhead and Pete Way was kind of on this hiatus from UFO, they decided to form a band and call it Fastway, right? Fast Eddie Clarke, Pete Way, Fastway, David King on vocals, Jerry Shirley from Humble Pie winds up joining. They go to record the album, and then we hear that, it looks like Pete Way is not going to be a member of the band going forward, right? So they did the album without him, kept the name, no Pete Way. Band does pretty well with the debut, right? Gets on a couple major tours. The second album comes out, it's kind of more the same, not quite as good. And then, the Fastway name kind of like, it's out there for a while, but they never really become that big of a band at all. And we find out later on that contractually, Pete Way couldn't appear in this band because of, I guess, legality things dealing with UFO or whatnot. So you ever think that what could have been for this band if Pete Way was allowed to join and continue on with the band? Would that have made an impact on this band getting bigger than they were? I mean, even here, you got of course, Pete wore those pants all the time. I mean, everything about this screams that Pete Way should be involved in this, and he wasn't. And I in seeing Fastway live a couple times back in the day, I always thought that he would have added a lot to them from a stage presence perspective, because Pete Way, a force of nature on stage, right? He was a total character. I think the band was rather, when you look at them on stage, kind of flat, right? They just came out and played and whatnot. And I think he would have added a lot to them from a live perspective. I think he would have added a lot from a writing perspective. And you just have to wonder, based on, and again, he put together Wasted not that long afterwards. They saw a little bit of the success, but also probably never got bigger than Fastway did. But you have to wonder, with that extra name in the band, could Fastway have made a little bit more of an impact than they did had he been able to stay in the band? Because when you really look at it, UFO around this time and going forward in the 80s also kind of struggling, right? So would it have made sense if this could have happened, that maybe UFO breaks up or they continue on with another bass player and he helps take Fastway to the next level, to probably where I think we saw the potential of this album and this band initially going, but it never really did. Do you think that could have happened? Do you think that the kind of mediocrity of this band kind of going forward would have been elevated a bit had they had someone like Pete Way in the band?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. He'd be great on stage. He's still part of the name, so he's like that second superstar, and you groom him into that second superstar thing by having him out there doing as many interviews as the other two guys. I mean, Dave King, you're grooming him as a superstar as well in this band. And we all know that second album is so frustrating because there's some amazing songs on there, but there's only 2 or 3, right? And then the rest of it starts going down. So the songwriting you don't feel is as good on there. And Pete Way is known as that rock and rollsy Rolling Stones kind of guy in UFO. So he could have brought those really catchy songs to that album. So you would have had the technical ones, and then you would have had some great Pete Way compositions on All Fired Up.
Did it ever come out? Did he have a hand in writing any of this, but couldn't be credited because of the?
I can't remember how that works, and I should know that because I've written a 7,000-word essay on that album that you could get as an ebook from Zunior.com for 99 cents. So I've written up the story of that, and of course I think I have some of that in my Motorhead book as well. But I just can't remember right now how much he had a hand in that. But I love that album to death, right? I mean, it's just top to bottom, just so much fun and so cool, right?
I've always thought that he must have had some of hand in writing this album, because the drop off in songwriting between this album and the second album is pretty significant. Mm-hmm. Like you said, other than a couple really great tracks, there's a lot of really mediocre stuff on that second album. It just doesn't compare to this at all. And
can you open that up and just what do the credits say in there for writers? What are you looking at?
All credited to Dave King, Jerry Shirley, and Eddie Clark.
Oh yeah, that sounds pretty suspicious, right?
Yeah, you would have to think, right?
Part of that too.
Yeah, you would have to think. And again, all the bass on this album, I guess, was credited to Eddie, right? Or do they not? I don't even remember them ever even saying.
Oh, how does that work? Who's Mickey Foot again? Is it the guy moving forward? Yeah. So yeah, it's not even really a band. That's the kind of it's one of those where it's messy, right? That you don't even feel like you've got a band there, because on the back, isn't it just 3 guys on the back?
3 guys. So it says Fast Eddie Clark guitar, Jerry Shirley drums, Dave King vocals, and harmonica. So no bass is even listed.
Oh, I hate that. Right? That never really crossed my mind, but because we've talked about that before, the messy non-band pictures and credits, right? Yeah. I just can't stand when that happens, right? And then by the same token, though, a negative of that idea, had he stayed, is that we wouldn't have gotten the great Wasted band. I mean, I love those records, right? I love Vices, Good, the Bad, and the Wasted. That's a good 2-album throwdown, right? The first Fastway versus Wasted Vices, because I think they're both masterpieces. I just love both of them.
Yeah, Vices is great. And I remember seeing them on that tour and thinking what a powerhouse they were live. And I think that's one of my points here, because he is such a force to be reckoned with live on stage. And I think that I don't even remember who was playing bass for Fastway the 2 times I saw them. I couldn't even tell you. But I just remember them being up there. They're just standing there playing. And this was the 80s. You needed that little bit of rock theater, right? And you never really got it with Fastway. Yeah, the songs are great, but I always felt with Pete Way up there, that brings this band to another dimension. But yeah, like you say, if that was allowed to happen, we probably never would have had those Wasted albums. So
yeah, yeah, such a cool band. I keep forgetting those even exist. I just love those records a lot, And then even the later one with what's his name, Danny Vaughan, right? On vocals, Save Your Prayers. That was really good too. That was like a good quality hair metal album, like super professional. Yeah, even that was a good album. But yeah, and that Heaven Tonight as a song, wow, that thing should have been a massive hit, right? I
Yeah,
love Finn. Finn as a vocalist, he was such a character too.
I never understood why that band didn't break bigger than they did. I mean, they were on all the high profile tours, man, open up for
Yeah,
Ozzy, right? I mean,
Maiden.
it just
Yeah,
didn't translate for whatever reason.
yeah. Well,
Maybe,
yeah, one of
again,
my
all the
fond
live.
memories is Fastway supporting Saxon supporting Maiden. I saw that tour,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
Yeah,
Yeah, I saw them at
yeah.
Maiden, and I saw them. Geez, trying to remember who the other. I saw them one other time as well, but yeah, we'll never know. We'll never know.
Cool. All right. So my next one is well, let's do this one next. So what if Rush was inspired by the new wave of British heavy metal rather than synth pop and the Police? Right. So Rush arrives. So we got actually I got a few props here to support that point. There are even non-Rush props, but so for Rush, we ended up with pastel green, right? We ended up with this thing, right? Um, and obviously we wound up with moving pictures as well, which is a little more guitar fiery. But yeah, so Rush, why I feel this is such a quote unquote waste in a way is that you know it's a bit of an untold story how much Rush is an influence on all those new wave of British heavy metal bands. And you could do a study of every time one of those new wave of British heavy metal bands did a slightly mellower song or a slightly proggier song, you could hear Rush all over them, right? They loved Rush, just like people in North America. They grew up learning their instruments to Rush albums. Those guys loved Rush, and Rush would go over there all the time and tour. They were like right, they were knees deep in the new wave of British heavy metal anyways as a touring entity, and they would have those bands back them up and stuff. And I remember seeing in Sounds always the little ads for the concerts, right, with the pentagram and all that stuff, right? So yeah, imagine if that band instead of going half as heavy went twice as heavy, right? Because that's basically what happened. And Alex would have come out as this great riff master and meister. I think they would have got bigger faster rather than just there was so much goodwill built up with Rush that the decline, if it was a decline at all, was slow. And it's basically not even really a decline because their concerts and ticket sales just got bigger and bigger and bigger all the time, kind of thing. Their record sales definitely went down. But I think and it's they're creative guys. It's like they think this whole discussion is stupid because they say, oh, we didn't want to do that, right? We were excited by this other music, right? But I think from a business standpoint, they would have just got bigger. They would have just got bigger and bigger. They might have been one of the biggest bands in the world had they got heavier over time, right?
Yeah, it's an interesting concept to think about. Like I'm sitting here while you're talking, I'm trying to imagine like what the songwriting and arrangements would sound like if Alex wasn't relying on these kind of like shimmering chorus driven guitar chords and things like that, and they were going for more frantic types of song structures that relied more on riffs but also lots of lead guitar, right? I'm trying to picture like Rush hearing like bands like Iron Maiden and Saxon and Satan and whatnot and saying we can kind of do that too, right? These kind of like punky guitar fueled, again, you only have one guitar player in Rush, but I could see them, multi-tracking things in the studio and, maybe not using synthesizers and more aggressive vocals and interesting, right?
And they also got into the idea of later on, they really like this idea of let's have a producer that will bring, his skills to the table and steer us a certain way.
Right.
So they always like that later on. I mean, it's still a couple albums before that starts happening, but had it started happening again, your Martin Birches and your Chris Tangerides and your Mutt Langs, like if you had some of those guys in there, where would the band have gone? And I don't want to waste these props, so I want to show that Status Quo, same kind of thing. So you get into Status Quo 1982, they're doing these kinds of records rather than getting heavier. So they're starting to get lighter, even though that looks like a new wave of British heavy metal album.
Yeah.
Actually looks like a Quartz album, and it looks like a Rainbow album, actually. Probably a couple others, right? So anyways, never too late. Well, it's too late for you guys being heavy anymore. There's another one, Just Supposing. Kind of looks like the last album cover, doesn't it? What's the last one?
They got this
Oh,
thing
look
with
at that. They both have missiles on it. I didn't notice that. Okay.
Yeah.
So basically Status Quo starts turning down the guitars, rocking all over the world sort of time. So what would have happened if they would have gone heavier? And of course, we've got Nazareth going from No Mean City to this at the same time. This is the other band that you thought, man, if the manager had his say, they would have said, participate in that new wave of British heavy metal. This is, you guys built this thing. You should be there as grandfathers of this, and as elder statesmen of this, and making your heaviest album ever. And then of course we've got Uriah Heep going from this, even though it's a heavy metal album cover, this is an abomination of an album, to this heavy metal album cover, and a pretty heavy album, right? It's exciting, it's commercial, but it's gritty production. And then you've got the likes of your Budgie, who actually were the ones who did it even more so than Heap, going from this, made in Canada, very tame 70s production, to this barnstormer of a super heavy metal album, right? Very heavy. And then this, which is not as heavy, but it's got an even more heavy metal album cover. Like that's a square on. This is early Derek Riggs, of course. That's why he's got it signed up there, right? But this is a squarely a new wave of British heavy metal album cover. You couldn't get more new wave of British heavy metal than that. So yeah, those are the trio of bands that man, had I wished they would have went twice as hard. Status Quo, Nazareth, and Rush.
The Nazareth thing, I've been told by many people, it's like, well, the reason Nazareth weren't like an immense band here is because of Dan's vocals. And you know what my answer to that always is? Bon Scott and Brian Johnson.
Yeah.
Don't give me that, right? There is no way that you can't tell me that Nazareth couldn't have been huge in the early mid 80s. And I agree with you 100% if they would have kept on with that heavy style. They just got lighter and lighter. It's just like, what happened? It's a shame.
Yeah.
All right, my next one. So we all know the story of Never Say Die, right?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of infighting in the band. They're not getting along with Ozzy. Everybody's got drug problems. They released this kind of weird album that doesn't really sound like classic Sabbath. And Ozzy winds up getting booted from the band, and they need to find a new vocalist. And Ozzy puts together Blizzard of Oz with a new band, and Black Sabbath find Ronnie James Dio and put together this album. So what happens if after this album, Sabbath says to themselves, guys, let's take a year break. Let's clean up a little bit, get our shit together. The 80s are coming. There's a lot of exciting new music coming out of Britain and all over the world. Let's chill out for a little bit, come back refreshed, and see what we can do. Obviously, if that happens, we never get this and we never get this. And let's not even talk about where Ronnie James Dio winds up, because we don't know. Maybe he hooks up with Michael Schenker, and who knows, right? Do you think that a new Black Sabbath album in 1980 sounds like a marriage of this? Because obviously Ozzy doesn't have Bob Daisley and Lee Kerslake to help write these songs, right? And there's no Randy Rhoads. Obviously, we got no Ronnie James Dio writing these kind of lyrics, right? Do the guys, the classic band, have enough in them to put together something that's as compelling as either of these? Or do we get another kind of, we're not quite sure what we're doing yet, one of these? I don't know. I think it's interesting to think about. I almost, as much as I love this band, and I think it would have been cool to see the classic lineup continue into the 80s, I almost don't know if that would have happened successfully. I almost think that these guys had to separate for these albums to happen. Obviously, that's the way it worked out. And I don't know if we get anything even remotely like either one of these if they stay together. What do you think, Martin?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think the first thing we get is a double live album, right? That would be cool. Get a double
Probably,
live
yes,
Sabbath album.
probably.
Yeah, yeah. And probably not from the Never Say Die tour either. They'll
No,
probably reach back and they're gonna have songs from kind of all over the
yeah,
place or whatever. So yeah, it's kind of cool. That would be neat to get a double live album because it's the hangover years of the golden era of these double live albums. Yeah, I think we never hear anything like the Aussie album. And then yeah, it's so interesting. You'll get another album with Geezer writing lyrics, and at this point he's like he self-deprecating, typical old, lovable Geezer. He's saying, I'm running out of things to say. And, everything I'm writing, I just don't feel confident I have anything interesting to say. So yeah, what happens with the lyrics? I guess Jolene Turner's out of a job because Ronnie probably goes back to Rainbow eventually, right? So that's moving along. Or maybe he starts a solo career right away, but I think he ends up back in Rainbow. That they'll do that thing. Maybe Richie sees the light, and there is the new wave of British heavy metal, and he says, "Yeah, we got to make another album like Rising or Long Live Rock and Roll, right? And participate in this thing, right?" So
yeah.
we're
I don't
back
know.
to that whole thing, but
Yes, both of these albums were right place, right time, and I just because if you put the original four back together, there's certain people not involved that were integral to both of these being successes, and I don't think we get a Sabbath album that approaches either one of these. To be honest with you,
yeah, yeah.
Do we go back to something like a Technical Ecstasy? Perhaps, maybe, or does Ozzy realize, hey, we got to compete with all these, young guys out there, and Tony says, yes, we got to make something really heavy. Maybe they do. I don't know, but I agree with him. Maybe that long-awaited official live album happens, but I don't know.
Here's another point for you. So I think maybe what happens is, management convinces Tony that this is the first time that we're going to put you with a high profile producer, and it's going to be someone who's really going to help you with the songs and tear things apart and take the band away from more or less the production role with engineers, right?
Yeah.
So maybe that happens and they end up with we'll mention him every single time, Chris Changeridis or someone like that, or
Right.
or maybe it is Martin Birch, right?
It is Martin Birch, right? Can you see that?
Yeah.
I mean, has Ozzy ever worked with Martin Birch before? I don't believe so. So
I don't believe so. Yeah.
Yeah.
So Sabbath does work with one of these, but possibly, it's literally that time with the original band where it's like, okay, we really need someone to take over the reins here, sort of thing, because there's all these complaints on those last few albums that the guys are overworked because they're also kind of producing them at the same time, right?
Yeah. And I think Ozzy was open to trying something a little different because obviously the Blizzard and Diary of a Madman are very different from Sabbath albums. And I think he was open to that. And it's just a matter of the other three wanting to do something different. And Ozzy, I mean, obviously we saw with Heaven and Hell that they knew they needed to do something a little bit different, a little faster, a little more with the times. So it's possible, right? But again, was Geezer up to the task from writing lyrics? I don't know. I think Tony was up to it to try something different on the arrangements, but I don't know. We'll never know. Because I mean, we obviously when they did go and record stuff together again many years later, even that sounded a little bit different, but it was still essentially Sabbath, right?
Yeah. Okay, well, keeping it at sort of the same sort of orbit. My next one is, what if the new wave of British heavy metal never happened? And I have a reason for bringing this up, and it has to do with things like this. Metal Blade, the Metal Blade samplers, blah, blah, blah. So this is a little bit, I did a episode of my audio podcast, History in 5 Songs with Martin Popoff. That was how Lars Ulrich invented hair metal, right? So I think the interesting thing about the new wave of British heavy metal is I think hair metal doesn't happen if there is no new wave of British heavy metal. And I think hair metal doesn't happen if super fans like the great and late Bob Nalbandian and Lars Ulrich and Brian Slagle working at Oz Records and John Strednansky and all those guys, Ron Quintana, I think basically if there's no new wave of British heavy metal, there's no super excitement and enthusiasm about heavy metal in San Francisco and Los Angeles, and you don't get Brian Slagle bringing in all these imports, and you don't get Brian Slagle starting a record label and starting with compilations. So all these different bands, it's almost like a democratization of the scene. They're all showing up on records, including Metallica with Hit the Lights. I think having this great resurgence of metal caused metal period in Los Angeles, and sure, it causes Metallica and it causes thrash, and the new wave of British heavy metal very directly causes Metallica. They're almost like a tribute band
Yeah.
to the new wave of British heavy metal. They're just super excited about what's happening with metal right now. But I like I say in that episode, I think it basically causes Rat and Great White and all those guys too, and it's a little bit of that connective tissue of maybe perhaps the new wave of British heavy metal doesn't directly cause these first few bands that get going, but it's that connective tissue of that layer of super fans in the middle who are loving this stuff and promoting it,
Yeah.
that help cause both hair metal and thrash, and what you get in the middle, which is everybody who's on Metal Blade, the meat and potatoes metal that I used to call poverty metal, right? So it causes all that at the same time. So you get that middle metal, you get the hair metal, and you get the thrash, and it's all happening in California. And I think it's all happening because of the new wave British heavy metal. I took this out. I was hoping inside of here there were pictures of the those influential early compilations, but there isn't. They kind of just do this with the and I wrote the whole liner essay in this whole thing too. In fact, I had like a 60,000 word thing going on. But yeah, it's the whole history of Metal Blade is on here, and it's basically the history of Brian being so excited about metal and turning everybody on to these bands and bringing in all these imports that causes the entire scene. I almost pulled out my Anvil albums to show because of this, because that's another form of connective tissue, right? And Anvil, if there's no new wave of British heavy metal, Anvil doesn't do metal on metal and Forged in Fire, and they don't further excite the likes of your Metallica guys to be Metallica. So that's it. Yeah, I think my answer is like, if the new wave of British heavy metal never happened, my favorite answer is hair metal doesn't happen.
Yeah. And how big does a band like Iron Maiden get? And at that same token, the veterans of the scene like Motorhead and Judas Priest, do they get as big as they got if there is no
True
movement down there?
That's a great point. Scorpions and Priest and Sabbath and Ozzy and all those people don't have the same fame if the new wave British heavy metal.
Yeah. Yeah. It's almost like the new wave of British heavy metal, I think, invigorated the scene as a whole, regardless of where you were from, where you live, whether you were a band or not, or just a fan. I think it got people interested in metal in a big way. And then all of a sudden you got all these other bands popping up all over the place that were influenced by this excitement generated by this new type of music.
Yeah, and you weren't embarrassed to be into heavy metal because you were hammered by the critics into submission to thinking your music was stupid all through the 70s.
Yeah.
And then in the 80s, it's like, Biff's
Kind of
Biff's
cool
on the beach and beating people up because they're mad as Deep Purple is playing too loud, right? So yeah, go Biff.
Cool to be a metal fan, finally, right? Yep.
Yeah.
Exactly. Well, kind of on that same line. So Def Leppard is my last one for today. So what if Def Leppard never works with Mutt Lange? So we obviously know that when you listen to these albums, there's a big difference between this, and certainly this and this, right? If they never work with him, and this is a fine album, pretty good sounding album, right? Tom Alon worked on that one. Is this the breakthrough that it is? Because obviously the songs are here, but we know, we've heard over the years how much Mutt got involved in songwriting and arranging. So let's say they do work with him. No, forget it. They don't work with him on this, but they still have these songs. is this album as appealing to the masses, maybe sounding like this or this? I would argue not. I think Mutt is a very smart guy. I think he was really hip to all that was going on in music at the start of the 80s, certainly by 83, that he milked all that to death and made this stuff so infectious for people who aren't necessarily metal fans, right? Because I think we can say till the cows come home that this is not really appealing to fans who are really into new wave or British heavy metal stuff, whereas this is on the border, and this certainly is. So I would say, without Mutt Lange behind the machine here, this sounds completely different and maybe doesn't do big business like it does. I think he was very smart, knew all the sounds to get people coming back for more, making it really catchy, taking away a little bit of the heaviness, but still making a great hard rock record. But I would argue that maybe the band continues more in this kind of style, maybe does well for themselves, but they don't become the big phenomenon they do with these without Mutt Lange.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's almost becomes a debate about how much do you think they were superstars already on through the night. And I would say that there's some really encouraging building blocks. They're already on Polydor.
The songs
They're
are there, right? I
in
mean, the songs are
Mercury.
there.
Yeah, the songs are there. They're young. They look good. They end up getting a top name producer who does a good job, and Tom Allum. Maybe he's not that famous yet, but I mean, basically, he does a good job. So instantly, you've actually got literally you've got besides an album nobody cares about. I'm the only one who cares about, but the Quartz album, Stand Up and Fight. They've got other problems, but super professional new wave of British heavy metal album. But besides something like that, there might be another one or two. It certainly isn't the Iron Maiden album. You've actually got the most professional album to come out of that scene. Like literally in 1980, they're the most promising band, period. From that whole scene, they're way more commercially appealing than Motorhead or Saxon, and Maiden, and Angel Witch makes a fine album for the deep metalheads, but they're Def Leppard are the most promising band. So, what do they do for a second album? I think there's enough building blocks that they make another super fine album. It's almost like they may go the sort of fame level of an Iron Maiden, right? Where it's like, they do pretty good for Killers, they do pretty good for the next one, pretty good for the next one, and basically by Number of the Beast, they're a struggling enough working, but a headlining small hockey barn act in North America, right? So it's it's interesting. Had they brought another producer on, because a lot of producers will be a little more go with the flow and be party guys and not really direct the band. But you talk to those Def Leppard guys and they say Mutt tore apart those songs and he worked us to death and he made us better and better all the time. So he made those guys super, super professional, and they're young enough to be very impressionable. They could have gone a bad way. I mean, look what happened to Steve Clark. Look what happened to Pete Willis in the band too, right? So they could have been, notorious party dudes for all we know. After a while, they could all succumb to drinking and drugging too much and stuff, right? It is an interesting one. So I hate to give Mutt Lange so much credit because I can't stand, later Def Leppard sort of thing. But I think he was a big part in keeping driving those guys bigger and bigger.
Yeah, I mean, I think for the hardcore metal fans, let's just say, what if instead of working with him, they work with a Martin Birch or whoever, right? And they continue to put out albums that are, much, much more rocking and heavy, kind of like the second album going forward. And there's not all those ballads, and there's not all that the kind of like those big breezy shimmering harmonies that appeal to a lot more than just metalheads, right? Because you got the female crowd, right, who all of a sudden was drawn to this band. I'd argue that, just like you, that they probably are still a pretty notable big band, but not to the level that they got to. And and that we get asked this question all the time. It's like, well, what about those producers that basically really changed the band? And can a producer really manipulate a band so much that what you hear in the studio or from the studio sessions is really completely different than maybe the original intent of the band. I mean, I think this is a perfect example. I think
Yeah.
Mutt Lange really transformed this band, obviously in a good way for, you know, their pocketbooks, obviously, but for many of, you know, the long fans from the beginning, maybe not necessarily in a good way.
I guess the other interesting thing here is that, you know, for all their famous decrying as saying we're not part of the new wave of British heavy metal, and we actually really love Mott the Hoople and Queen way more than anything else, David Bowie and all this stuff. So it's like with the death of the new wave of British heavy metal coming like a freight train, they probably would have still they still would have gone on to command, you know, a very sizable space in the whole hair metal thing.
Yeah.
You know, and Tom Allom, so he's around and he's commercializing Judas Priest in a big way over the next few albums, and maybe Tom Allom does the next one and keeps them on a path, and maybe you start getting some of those really you know, we ended up with quite modern electronic drum sounds from Mutt Lange, but Tom Allom was doing the same sort of thing and giving pretty atrocious sounds to Screaming for Vengeance, and especially Defenders. Man, I play Defenders now and I go, I cannot stand the production on this album anymore, right? But imagine, you know, Def Leppard, had they you know, kept up relations with Tom Allom, might have had that turgid sort of different kind of electronic drum sound that you got from Dave Holland on Defenders, and on, you know, Screaming is getting its way to Defenders the same way High and Dry is getting its way over to Pyromania, right? So yeah, imagine them sounding a little more like a commercial Priest en route to the hair metal thing, and then they would have got maybe, I guess, even more hair metal, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
We'll never know. We'll never know. Anyway, there you have it, everybody. Some interesting what if scenarios. Let us know what you think of some of these and what you think outcomes might have been based on some of the points that we brought up, and any other interesting things that you might come up with that maybe we didn't mention today. So, Martin, what's new on your end with books and the podcast and Contrarians? Anything new, exciting coming up this week?
Yeah, well, on my path of celebrating the old catalog on my 30th anniversary of doing these books, I picked out another 3 old books that are still in print. So the entire, to keep it topical, the entire New Wave of British Heavy Metal trilogy is all in print through Weimer now. These are my old original self-published ones, but all of these are available. This is the one that's all the, I don't know, what do we got here? Anyway, two of these are timeline and quotes of the entire you know, story, detailed timeline, 500 or 600 pages. One of them is every album and every single reviewed. So those are all available from martinpopoff.com. Of course, we still got the Contrarians. We had just put up one of our, what was it? Crappy album covers by our favorite bands. That just went up. And I had Bob Wagner back on to do a episode about Max Webster again. And I've got the audio podcast. I have no idea what I'm going to do for the next one, but what was the last one? Oh yeah, I can't unhear that. So it was all examples of things that when somebody tells you something about an album or a band, it kind of ruins your appreciation of that band, because now it's in your head and you realize that oh yeah, John Bonham's drum pedal is squeaky on this song, you know. It's and now I can't unhear that.
That's all you're going to focus on now, right?
Yeah, exactly. So it's a bunch of Pink Elephants examples of stuff. So so that was a cool one. So yeah, that's what's going on.
Yeah, Bob's Max Webster books just arrived yesterday. Holy cow, that is huge.
Oh yeah.
This box comes in and weighs a ton. I'm like, oh, this has got to be it. I open it up. I'm like, wow, this is immense. How you read that thing, right? You got to sit up in some kind of really strong chair, right?
So cool. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll be digging into that coming up. So, and I do want to mention, you guys are going to be seeing a tribute video here on the channel today, but we lost Randy Meisner from the Eagles, obviously on the 26th, 2 days ago. So rest in peace, Randy Meisner. And coming up, what do we got here? Later this afternoon here on the channel, 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, the Professor's Picks. Myself and Ken Golden, Ken will be showing some of the new releases that are coming out today in prog, power metal, prog metal, and fusion. So stay tuned for that. We've got the UK connection coming up tomorrow with Stephen Reed and Simon Bray. And then Sunday, Rick Labonte and myself will be ranking the catalog of the winery dogs. That's happening, as well as the Curse of the Collector coming up this weekend too. So we got a lot going on here at the channel this weekend, and stay tuned for Martin and myself here at the Funhouse next Friday. Visit us on the web at www.seatranquility.org. We're on Facebook, we're on YouTube, all together all the damn time. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and click on that notification bell so you get alert of all of our content as it posts. And please do hit the like button before you leave. Also, we got the links below to our Ko-Fi page for channel donations, as well as our merch page where you can get cool Sea of Tranquility stuff like this, the Great Serpent shirt. So thanks in advance for all your support there. For Martin Popoff, I am Pete Pardo. We'll see you next week here at the Funhouse. Take care.